Okay, so welcome everyone. Before we get started, we'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia, but in particular the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation on whose land those of us in Perth at least are meeting today. So we recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community, and we pay respect to elders past and present. For anyone who doesn't know me, my name's Joel Bailey. I'm on the PIANC board and also the member of the WA chapter. We've got a great seminar coming up today with Chandra, but before I hand over to her, I've just got a few messages, a bit of housekeeping and some messages from PIANC, which I'll just run through. So firstly, it's a pretty interesting format for us tonight and pretty complex. We've got obviously the people here who are meeting in the Indian Ocean Marine Research Centre. We have a group of people, I believe, who are sitting in the WGA offices in West Perth. And we've also got a bunch of people online. So I think at the moment we've got about 61 people in total online. So really great attendance. And just thank you all again for supporting PIANC events. Getting along to these events is what makes it possible for us to continue doing them. So for those of you in auditorium, I've just got a few little bits of housekeeping. We do have some COVID-19 requirements. So I can see everyone sitting in the designated seats that we have here today. But if you do happen to get up and move around, if you need to go to the bathroom or anything, please come back to the seats which are marked for sitting in. If you haven't already, we do need you to sign in. So if you haven't signed in, please see Renan, who's just up the back. We need to get you to sign in and give us your contact details, and we'll also need everyone to sign out when you leave. If you do happen to be feeling unwell, we'll ask you to leave as well. Bathrooms are through the lateral doors, so any of these side doors will take you through the bathrooms if you need a bathroom. And in case of emergency, if there's any alarms or that sort of thing, Renan up the back will be our guide to the muster point, which I believe is the main oval. UWI oval. So Renan will lead us safely in event of any sort of emergency. For those of you online, welcome. I think it goes without saying this sort of mixed format is pretty new for us. So bear with us if there's any sort of technical difficulties. We are recording the event, so in the possibility that we have any sort of technical issues, we'll make sure that we'll sort that out in the recording and get that out to everyone afterwards. For those of you online, also the Q&A is open. So if you haven't found that already, there is a little button in the Teams app which looks like two speech marks with a question mark, two speech bubbles with a question mark, I should say. So you click there and you can start sending through your questions right from the start. And what we'll do is we'll make sure that we read those out to Chandra at the end of the session. Quick reminder, there are drinks and nibbles and that sort of thing at Varsity Bar in Nedlands straight after the event. So basically as soon as we end here, we'll all be heading there. Anyone in Perth, whether you're joining us online or you're here in person, is more than welcome to join us at Varsity Bar for a drink afterwards. So just a few messages also from PIANC. I'm sure there's a few people who will be new to the organisation who are either in the room tonight or joining us online. We're the World Association for Waterborne Transport Infrastructure. We're non-political, non-profit, volunteer-run global organisation. And our mission is really to bring together the best international experts on everything relating to ports, harbours and marinas. There's two things that PIANC's really known for, and that's our high quality technical reports, so the international working group papers that get produced on everything relating to waterborne transport infrastructure. And secondly, our events, and they range from major international conferences, one of which I'll be touching on in a minute, and also then the regional seminars and networking events like we have tonight. So just a quick update on one of our conferences that's coming up. PIANC APAC 2020, you may have heard about this a little bit earlier in the year. We were planning to run it earlier in the year, but obviously with COVID-19, our plans have changed. We had a local organising committee meeting this week, and what we can announce is that the conference is definitely going ahead. It's being run late November, early December, and the dates you can see there. The best thing to do is to go to the PIANC2020.com website. You can sign up there for the announcements as they come out. And there will be some announcements coming out in the next week or two with more details on the program and that sort of thing. We will be running the conference in person, so people who are able to travel to Perth will be able to come to the Esplanade Hotel in Fremantle and attend that one in person. And we'll also be streaming it live online. So it's basically going to be available to anyone to get along to that. So as I say, go to PIANC2020.com and you can get all of the details there as they come out. Tonight's talk from Chandra touches on a couple of our recent working groups, or working groups that are actually being produced at the moment. So I just want to touch on those two quickly. Working Group 170, which is about sea turtles and mammals. Wayne Young, who some people might know, is on that international working group, and that's been going for a couple of years now. And the other one, Working Group 226, has just been recently, or it's due to be established very soon, I believe, and that's on underwater sounds. So obviously some great connection there with the talk we'll be having from Chandra tonight. If anyone's interested in joining an international working group and getting involved in that way, PIANC Australia does provide support in terms of travel assistance, which may be a little bit difficult at the moment. But support in all sorts of ways for people to join in those international working groups, providing the next guidance that's coming out on all sorts of things relating to waterborne transport infrastructure. So that's it from me. I'm just going to introduce Chandra. So our speaker tonight is Chandra Salgado Kent. Hopefully I've pronounced that correctly. Chandra is an associate professor at Edith Cowan Uni and director of the Oceans Blueprint, and has been a researcher in the marine field for 2 decades. Chandra studied whales and dolphins in Perth and more broadly, and that includes a fair amount of published research, extensive knowledge of the impact of port activities, and in particular underwater noise, which is what Chandra will be talking about tonight. So please join me in welcoming Chandra.
All right, thank you so much for having me today, and bear with me, I'm just looking at myself in the camera to make sure that only this part of me is showing. Sounds very odd, but I might just adjust it a little bit. Excellent, and thanks for everyone online as well. I will try to remember to look at you as well as everyone here today. So it's a privilege to have been invited to speak today here at the PIANC event. Today I'll be speaking about evaluating potential impacts of pile driving noise on marine mammals, and I do need to remember to stand in front of the camera. I'm used to moving around. For those of you who haven't yet met me, I spent 15 years at Curtin University at the Centre for Marine Science and Technology, and I'm now Associate Professor at Edith Cowan University and the Director of Oceans Blueprint. To start off, I'll first give a bit of background for the scope of the work that I've been involved in over the years. It's always nice to know a bit about the person that's actually presenting in front of you. Then I'll briefly talk about considerations of meeting regulatory requirements in Western Australia. I'll follow this with an example of a study on impacts of pile driving on dolphins within this area here locally. Then I'll conclude with some key points for meaningful and cost-effective approaches or options for impact assessment and mitigation. I've been privileged to work over a broad range of locations over the past 20 years, from the so-called Great Pacific Garbage Patch in the Pacific between San Francisco and Hawaii, all the way to the Atlantic in tropical Floridian waters. Closer to home, I've had the opportunity to work in the Oceania region for the southern latitudes, from the southern latitudes of Australia, all the way to the waters in the Timor Sea and the Savu Seas, in Timor-Leste. Much of my work has focused on government, industry, and community progress in marine science. And I feel lucky to contribute on an ongoing basis to such things as environmental impact assessment, wildlife modeling, global science prioritization, species recovery and management, and developing and testing innovative wildlife monitoring techniques as well as statistical modeling techniques. I also feel privileged to regularly be invited to participate on a range of expert panels, called upon to review impact assessments as an independent expert, peer review journals, and also assess ARC grant applications. That's the Australian Research Council grant applications. None of these would be possible without the many, many collaborators that I've worked with over many years that have made all of these amazing things possible. And I'm always deeply grateful for their partnerships. The scientific activity I've plunged myself into ranges from ecological modeling, citizen science, assessing impacts of marine wildlife, of course, as well. One of the aspects of human impacts I've been active in is that of sound on marine fauna, including understand the soundscapes that they occupy, the sounds that they produce and why they produce them, and how the noise we produce impacts them directly and indirectly, which is the topic that I'll be talking about today. In the context of impact assessment, today I'll be referring to the Western Australian EPA's guidelines for marine fauna. I won't be mentioning the full range of considerations that we do need to have in mind, of course, which include the Commonwealth regulations as well as requirements of NOPSEMA for oil and gas. In the EPA's guidelines regarding activities that impact fauna, the EPA states that those that need to be considered include those that harm individuals or cause population declines for state protected species. Note that there's a bilateral agreement as well with the Commonwealth that also requires the consideration of EPBC listed species. Activities that reduce locally and regionally important species populations, that impact species that fulfill critical ecological functions, that impact critical habitats, or that introduce or spread invasive marine species or disease. And here I've included a photo that I took a number of years ago on one that relates to the harm to individuals, where we can see an endangered blue whale, EPBC listed. And in this particular case, this was just locally up at Yanchep. And what you can see on the lower image is striations where there are lacerations from impact or collision with a large vessel. At that time, the population in population that migrates along the Western Australian coast had been estimated at around 1,500 animals, a bit above. So if we can imagine that this might happen once a year, we start to get an idea of the potential impact it actually has for a very long-lived animal. The EPA further states that where marine fauna have been identified, the proponent may need to provide information or studies on marine fauna to identify critical habitats, ecological windows, values and significance of marine fauna, assess threats and pressures, quantify direct and indirect impacts, consider cumulative impacts from other existing activities in conjunction with the activities that we're proposing. And this is a critical part that quite often we can easily overlook. And finally, demonstrate how impacts will be avoided, managed, and mitigated. And for proposals that generate significant underwater noise, model likely impacts, including delineating areas of likely physical impact as well as areas of likely behavioral impact. And of course, this is because sound travels differently in different environments based on the attributes of those environments, meaning that the noise levels received by animals at one location may be very different from another location. Within the areas that I focused on over the years, for this presentation, I'll be focused on looking at anthropogenic impacts on marine wildlife, and in particular dolphins, but also looking at the use of novel techniques. So we took the opportunity during this study to be able to implement and test a new novel technique, and did an assessment on its cost benefit and published that work to show that in fact it was a cost-effective approach to monitoring dolphins. So that technology was using cameras. So this study, more specifically, looked at evaluating the responses of Indo-Pacific bottlenose dolphins to pile driving noise in the Fremantle Inner Harbour here in Western Australia. So Indo-Pacific bottlenose dolphins are in fact listed now as near threatened by the IUCN, which is something that we certainly need to take note of. It is the global authority that looks at the current status of different species globally, and certainly feeds into and informs the EPBC listing within Australia. And of course, state listings. It's informed by that, as well as other information collected over time. So this work was completed while I was at Curtin University at the Centre for Marine Science and Technology, and was supported through funding from Fremantle Ports. A range of people contributed to this work, which I'll acknowledge as we move through the presentation. So this work builds on knowledge gained over the past decades on bottlenose dolphins within the Swan Canning River estuary. And the fact that we have this knowledge is absolutely key to be able to understand how to interpret the assessment of impacts to this population. This work has been a long-term project conducted by a range of different organizations and individuals to be able to develop a full picture, as full as it can get at this point, of what's happening with this population. And certainly there's still a long way to go for us to understand. Those organizations have been Fremantle Ports that I think have been contributing for 20 years or more. I'm looking, sorry, to everyone online, I'm looking in the direction of Adam at Fremantle Ports, and he's nodding yes. The Department of Biodiversity Conservation Attractions through the River Guardians program and Dolphin Watch, as well as other sectors of DBCA, have been absolutely amazing in the work that they do, and also funding they've provided over the years. Gaia Resources, Murdoch University, Curtin University, Edith Cowan University, and Ocean's Blueprint. And many colleagues, collaborators, and volunteers over the years. And of course, today, I'm talking about underwater noise component, but we can see here all the different components, including dolphin community demographics, social structure, acoustic communication, home range and core areas, foraging ecology, seasonal distribution occurrence trends, health, which is an absolute critical component, and then looking at underwater noise impacts. To orient ourselves, the study took place here in Western Australia, within the Swan River estuary, in the Fremantle Inner Harbour, near what are the train and traffic bridges located just here. This is my smooth version of zooming in. I've not quite gotten the technique yet. Plunging into the waters of the Fremantle Inner Harbour, we discover what was coined the silent world by Jacques Cousteau. But of course, we realize that in fact, it's not a silent world at all. The underwater world is very far from the silent world. It is an extraordinarily acoustically complex and dynamic place, and marine fauna have adapted to it and depend on sound for survival and reproduction in these often low visibility environments. So the image here is of a dolphin traveling past within the Fremantle Inner Harbour. We can hear it communicating with its whistles, and also we note that this is a really fantastic visibility day. And probably we wouldn't be able to see another dolphin within about 10 meters beyond this animal here. Turns out that water is a highly conducive medium for sound. Sound travels at more than 4 times the speed it does in air. Sounds from whales can travel tens of kilometers and more in certain conditions. Note that this distance is highly dependent on the environment and is often either misquoted or not qualified. To give you an example, in Geograph Bay, modeling work that we did showed that blue whales would not be able to be heard more than 6 kilometers. Yet in other areas off the shelf, we can hear them for 1,000 kilometers. So it completely depends on the environment, which is why so often it's important to model the sound propagation to be able to assess impacts. The modest dolphin may communicate up to around 20 times the distance of humans do at speech level. To be able to better conceptualize this, I've drawn a rough line representing relative distance that sound may travel for whales, dolphins, and humans. Those are dolphins, which was not meant to be the first one to appear. And our whales. Those are whales recorded in Geograph Bay down south, and the dolphins that you hear or you just heard are ones that were recorded in the Fremantle Inner Harbour. Whales and dolphins have adapted to sound to communicate and navigate their environments. Dolphins, for instance, produce biosonar. I think everyone in this room knows that, and most online, I'm sure, and I've forgotten to look at you as well. Produce biosonar that allows them to create a 3-dimensional picture of their environments as they navigate through it, and to be able to localize prey and capture it. These animals depend upon sound and are highly sensitive to it. Exposure to underwater man-made noise to these animals can cause a range of different things. Masking of sounds, for instance, that they depend on. To give an idea, here are some sounds recorded within the Fremantle Inner Harbour. The first is of normal operational noise. The second is of dolphins that are communicating and clicking away using their biosonar. The third is vibratory pile driving, and the fourth is impact pile driving. And I'll play one and then the next so that we can hear the layers of sound that make up a busy port. That's normal operational sound. We're snapping a shrimp in the background. You can hear dolphins in the background. So not only can masking occur, but behavioral responses occur as well, such as avoidance or attraction. So a study a number of years ago came out showing that local seals, in fact, were being attracted to a pinger that was designed to be able to deter them and ensure that they weren't capturing their prey. So it's more like a dinner bell. Whereas other work in the Northern Hemisphere on grey whales indicated that pile driving, in fact, resulted in whales moving completely away from a key foraging area. Noise can cause stress, of course, which studies in humans indicate that it reduces our immune systems. And of course, render people and animals more prone to disease. It can cause hearing impairment, both temporary and permanent. In extreme cases, it causes tissue damage and can lead to mortality, particularly for impulsive signals with very rapid change in peak pressures. And those cause gas-filled cavities to rupture. Man-made noise continues to grow globally, and it's an issue that we need to contend with. Current knowledge on potential impacts on cetacean life processes continues to be limited, although we certainly have made a lot of progress over recent decades. Sonar and seismic co-occurring with mass strandings is regularly in the news and quite often takes the spotlight. Pile driving impacts is something we're still trying to understand, and while we're getting a better understanding of it, we still have a long way to go. For those that are not familiar with pile driving, two common approaches are impact pile driving and vibratory pile driving. Impact pile driving involves placing a weight within a sheath that fits over the pile and then dropping it multiple times until it's driven into the seabed. Vibratory pile driving involves the continuous vibration of weight downward until the pile again is driven into the seabed. As for all ports, either under construction or maintenance, pile driving was undertaken in Fremantle in 2010 for wharf reconstruction. In this case, we have an amazing location that's actually utilized by dolphins quite pervasively. It turns out that Fremantle Inner Harbour is used regularly by around 45 dolphins. 20 of these have their home range ranging from the upper reaches past Guildford all the way down through the waters of the CBD, Matilda Bay, Freshwater Bay, and down through Blackwall Reach, through the Inner Harbour and out to Owen Anchorage. Another 25 or so dolphins from the Coburn Sound community also use the Inner Harbour, all the way up to around Freshwater Bay. The Inner Harbour is mainly used by these dolphins to transit, and between the months of April to August is also used for foraging. And these animals will forage over long periods every day within the Inner Harbour. This study builds on previous work that myself and a master's student of mine, Estenio Paiva, and several colleagues, including Ian Parnham and Monique Gagnon at Curtin University and Rob McCauley at Curtin University conducted. The previous work that I'm going to mention now first assessed whether dolphins reduced occupancy within the Inner Harbour during pile driving, during the peak period that they forage in that area. The work was undertaken over 4 months, and it used high-definition video camera on a 3-meter tower to record dolphins transiting the field of view of the camera, shown here in the hashed or the shaded blue, the camera position where the blue point is, and the wharf reconstruction where the red is located. So the camera recorded during daylight hours, during periods of pile driving and no pile driving. The findings of this work, which we published, show that there was reduced detection in dolphins when pile driving was occurring. In addition, we estimated that dolphins experienced sound energy levels of 140 to 175 dB for impact and 140 to 161 for vibratory pile driving. These measures are not cumulative. That means, for instance, for the SELs, that was of one single impulse. So that means that a dolphin would receive that energy level with a single impulse. Now, those levels were not sufficient to cause hearing damage or hearing impairment in dolphins. However, we later estimated the cumulative exposure that would have resulted in, and we worked out that if animals were within 1 kilometer of the activity for a duration of 45 minutes, that they would actually reach that critical point, or the threshold where they would begin to experience hearing impairment. So this was really, really important progress, and we got great insight into what can be done to be able to mitigate impacts. However, we still really didn't know what was happening after pile driving stopped. Did animals still stay away, or did they come back? Did these animals reoccupy quickly or not? So this is what I'll talk about briefly here now. This particular work done previously, plus this added work that I'm going to talk about, is absolutely important, of course, to be able to improve our ability to be able to mitigate impacts and manage them, both locally as well as globally. So in this work, I used the same data, and I used an advanced statistical approach to assess changes in activity before, during, and after by applying hidden Markov models. High activity reflected in these Markov models, so there are multiple states, and you assess transition probability between states. So in this case, it was a high activity state and a low activity state. High activity reflected a combination of dolphins occupying the area and also using it over a duration of time, because of course they're using it to forage, so they'll stay there for hours. While low activity reflected low occupation and or periods spent in the study area that were relatively short. Of the 40 days we studied, or 40 odd days that we studied, 25 contained pile driving activity with variable start, end time, durations, as well as number of sessions. And in this figure, you can see in black is no pile driving. The yellow, darker yellow, and red are when pile driving was occurring, and you have time from 6 a.m. to 1800 on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis the dates from May to August. And so of course you can see the high variability in the activities that were occurring. While our ideal scenarios in science is to control the experiment and eliminate all confounding factors that cause the noise to in fact mask the signal of interest, we can't exactly put a dolphin in the Fremantle port randomly selected from the community and get it to be at a certain distance from the pile driving activity, and then of course request the operators that are running high expenses to please start at a very specific time in the morning and to end at a certain time. So of course this is something that we always need to contend with in this particular area of science where we really cannot control the environment. In addition, of course, we had to contend with tides and changing tides over days, as well as biological rhythms that dolphins may change their behavior around that we could not control. And again, this points to the real need to be using sophisticated statistical techniques to be able to account for these. We can explore what activity on the vertical axis of this figure looks like before, during, and after pile driving for each day in this figure. And so on the horizontal axis, we can see time from commencement of pile driving, which is the red vertical dotted line down before. And then the green color indicates before pile driving, red is during pile driving, and blue is after pile driving. And each one of these panels is a day out of those 20 odd days. And so we can see a lot of variability. Of course, these are wild animals responding to a range of different things. We can select a few different days and we can say, oh, well, there you go. I can see, you know, there's a bit of activity. It's higher before pile driving. As soon as pile driving occurs, they're no longer active in the area. And also they don't seem to recover. But there are other days where you do see a rapid recovery. And then there's still other days with no activity before or after, and so on. So if we extract the 10 days in which there were dolphins active within the study area an hour before pile driving commenced, we can see a 5-fold drop during pile driving, and then an increase to around half the pre-pile driving activity at about 2 hours afterwards. And after 5 hours, we see almost complete recovery. We also saw that the probability of transitioning from high to low activity increased during pile driving activity, and from low to high activity increasing after 3 hours of piling. In this case, we can see probability of being in a high activity state was low during pile driving, but highly variable, which is interesting as well, and then slowly increasing over time after piling ceased. So what have we learned? From the long-term research on dolphins in the area and the new research focusing on potential impacts to dolphins, We've learned that the dolphin community is quite small within the Swan River, and it's relatively vulnerable. The harbour is critical habitat for these animals to be able to reach the extents of their home range as well as to forage within the area. There are multiple pressures and threats present with 2 dolphin mortality events over the past decade. Each one of those involved the mortality of around 5 dolphins each. The most recent one was just this past year. We know that morbillivirus and fishing line entanglements have been identified as issues. Of course, we have in our minds as well what it means to be stressed and what that means to immune system responses. We know that we can avoid acute direct impacts of noise by implementing shutdown zones for mitigation. We were able to measure these by measuring the noise received at different distances from pile driving activities. And again, noting that each pile driving activity is going to be different with a different received level depending on what the piles are made out of, what the hammer energy is, and all the other contributing conditions such as the environment itself and the seabed. We know that noise exposure increases stress levels, as mentioned before, reducing immune response, and that indirect impacts are not avoided during pile driving, with foraging opportunities reduced during pile driving, but that they relatively recover because it is a critical location for this community. So this means we can time periods of pile driving around these peak periods of occupancy to be able to reduce the risk of having an impact. We still have many unanswered questions, such as the effect of cumulative pressures on as well as long-term noise exposure on these dolphins. So I'd like to finish with a few key points for meaningful environmental impact assessments and scientific research studies, given the challenges we face. The EPA describes this challenge well in stating that the size and remote nature of much of Western Australia, combined with a high level of biological diversity and a lack of full knowledge, is a key challenge to impact assessments for marine fauna in Western Australia. It also states that while region-wide studies are beyond the capacity of any individual proponent, the EPA strongly encourages the sharing of information on marine fauna so that there is a collective improvement and consolidation of knowledge over time. This increased certainty will result in more straightforward assessments and also lead to improved environmental outcomes. And I've actually heard industry itself quite often comment on the fact that rather than putting out one big fire when it happens, working on continually putting out small fires or even controlling those fires over a long period of time makes a lot more sense, and to do it jointly. Of course, the problem that we have here in the local area, say Fremantle ports, may not be so different or has a range of specific elements that are similar to those in a different area, such as Broome ports or Albany ports or wherever else. Obviously, each is unique as well and must be assessed as unique, but certainly there are learning opportunities in being able to put resources together and to try to find out the answers to some of these questions that we'll be facing over the long term over and over and over again. I would say also that we can certainly take opportunities to test new cost-effective technologies where they arise. They may make our lives a lot easier in the long run. In light of the challenges that we face, I feel these quotes are relevant. Benjamin Franklin said, "An investment in knowledge always pays the best interest." And George Bernard Shaw said, "Beware of false knowledge. It is most dangerous, more dangerous than ignorance." Over the years, a number of assessments have crossed my path, either informally or through a requested independent expert review that have caused concern. Because much of our development work is undertaken at short notice and under pressure, either the absence of knowledge or the inadequate use of it have caused EIAs to be a tick box exercise rather than a meaningful advancement in our practices. While availability of resources are always a challenge, working in partnerships in continuous advancement of knowledge relieves the full financial pressure of any one organization, and increases the chances of producing meaningful work that improves practices in our activities. I'd like to end this presentation by pointing you to a resource available online that summarizes, I think it summarizes, hopefully, all considerations that you need to make when assessing underwater noise impacts or understanding the knowledge in science, the considerations that need to be made when looking at noise impacts. It provides a review of knowledge up until 3 years ago on noise impacts on marine fauna, the full range of marine fauna, including birds, penguins and diving birds in Australia. And the report is available online on that very faded link. It was an APIA commissioned report, and while it was commissioned to look at oil and gas activities and impacts, this includes every aspect of operations such as shipping and pile driving of other regular activities outside of the oil and gas context. It is, I think, almost 200 pages long. You can find it on the APIA website if you can't read this link, but just contact me, obviously, if you would like to have a copy of that report or can't access the link. Finally, I'd like to thank the many contributors to this work and collaborators over the years, with particular thanks to individuals within the Fremantle ports, as well as the Department of Biodiversity Conservation Attractions and Curtin and Murdoch universities that have made gaining this knowledge possible. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions. I can't guarantee I'll be able to answer them, but I'm happy to take them.
Okay, so we might take a question from the people who are attending in the room first of all, and then we'll have a look online and see if we can find some questions on there. So do we have a question from the room to start with? So yeah, if you speak into the mic, then they'll be able to hear you online.
Thanks, Chandra. Quick one, with specific to piling, were you able to look at any soft start related behavioural changes? Are you able to do a soft start in that type of construction work, or any thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I haven't looked in the last year or two to see what the new research is on whether soft starts are effective, and I'd love to hear comments from anyone who has seen recent work. But certainly you'd think that's the way to go, and it makes sense. We, in our case, did not look at the response of dolphins to soft starts or whether it was effective. But yeah, absolutely. To me, at least, it's a logical thing to do, but it'd be great to see the science coming out. Does anyone know of any recent science looking at the effectiveness and whether I should be looking at the comments here? Okay, well, let me know and we'll read them out for the response. And part of the reason why we couldn't test those things, one is obviously we couldn't. Again, it's in an uncontrolled environment, it's difficult to make that request of operators. And then second, how do you line up the dolphin? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, definitely. Yep. Start with lower energy. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just take one question from the web. So Chandra, you mentioned timing works around peak occupancy times for dolphins. Were you referring to times of the day or broader seasons, and how can this be predicted for a particular site or a particular project?
Yeah, and it looks like Claire's is asked that question. So that's such a fantastic question, Claire. And we have not found any evidence to show that particular times of the day are periods when dolphins are using more or less. It's not to say that it doesn't occur, but we've not seen evidence. And certainly every time I go down at different hours, from anywhere from 6 in the morning, the afternoon, or even 1 in the morning when I've been down to the Fremantle ports working there with dolphins, they seem to be, I mean, when it's peak foraging period, it's peak foraging period. Certainly, probably they are working around the tides, and then the tides are going to be changing from day to day. So I think, you know, it is a site specific problem, I suppose. In the Fremantle Inner Harbour, it's a period of the season that they're just working the area constantly to forage in it. So I think that if it is feasible, and I'm always conscious of, you know, resources and constraints, but certainly, again, going with a precautionary approach, definitely working outside of those peak seasons, but it may be different in a different area.
Just ask a follow-up question, because I've got the microphone and I can. So compared with Fremantle Ports, full disclosure where I'm from, other proponents, other sites, I guess our audience, there'll be a lot of proponents and constructors and engineers, particularly online and in the room. So I'm curious as to, with your independent assessor hat as well, so when you're reviewing these proposals with the EPA or for the EPA or however you're reviewing them, what sort of information do you have in terms of, studies or populations or behaviours that I guess decisions are made upon? And what are, if I can add to that, perhaps some of the challenges of bringing together the conservation outcomes with the, I guess, the delivery of projects that you see are, I guess, the really big challenges or issues for, you know, getting that balance right at the approval. So maybe the next, 10 years, where's the focus to get that right?
Yeah, okay. That's a really challenging question. I'd like to invite you to answer it. So let me make sure I remember. There was a two-part question. The final part was very much about where do you see progress into the future to be able to see improvement, I suppose, in being able to ensure that we are meeting the regulatory requirements as well as, and the lack of knowledge, I suppose, and how do we cross that bridge? Is that what it is? Okay. Yeah.
Joint outcome, and
Yes.
and the first part of the question was around, proposals or proponents or projects outside of Fremantle where you've studied intently.
Yeah.
What's the sort of the level of sort of understanding outside of Fremantle around the place?
Okay, all right. So I'll answer this first, I guess, on dolphins, and I'm going to put it into the context of Australia. Yeah, okay, I'm getting a nod. So outside of, in terms of port, I don't know if your question is very much about industry side of support in terms of trying to answer these questions, or I suppose research across those go hand in hand quite often, port and research. It tends to be that most research is occurring, and I'm saying research in the context of doing a study to be able to fulfill the requirements for regulation, that tends to happen in response to a sudden need. And so one of the issues is that a lot of the knowledge is just simply not available as that's happening. And so I don't think I think we're just reacting rather than actually thinking carefully about where we need to get to and working towards that progress. So I think actually you hit exactly on what one of the points that I was trying to make is that perhaps it's easier to be able to work on this slowly over the decades, piece by piece, rather than suddenly big resource and big fire, try to answer the question because the development's about to occur and everything's under pressure. And when we do that, we have giant knowledge gaps, and then there's just this enormous pressure, and quite often things are missed. So yes, so I think that it, and again, I've heard this from industry as well, interest in getting together as partners across, again, the range of ports, if it's port activity or shipping or whatever it is, a range of different stakeholders that have this as something they absolutely need to address, and it makes sense to be working forward together on it.
Take another question from in the room, if there is one. Yes.
So I was wondering how you determined. Thank you. I was wondering how you determined, or how you're seeing industry determine the significant impact. So the significant part of the impact, or whether it's just the SEL values that are being identified.
Yeah, so and a lot of the consultants in the room will probably be able to advise on the newest methods, but certainly it's very much looking at SELs as well as probabilities of animals being in the area, and then working out the risk matrices and certainty of risk. So and then it's going back to exactly the wording, whether it's with the Commonwealth regulation or state regulation, on what constitutes a significant impact. And I think you kind of have got it. That's the place where you go, oh, hang on, let me read this 5 times to see if I understand clearly what constitutes a significant impact. I think this is my take on it and my personal view on it. And I do think there's a bit of space around it to be able to, it's not like quantitative research where there's the threshold of 163.258. It's not that. Again, this is my take on it. I've just gotten myself in trouble, I'm sure, with the 60-odd people online.
Okay, I got another question from the people online. So this one's from Phil Scott. Is short periods of noise spread over a long period likely to have less marine fauna impact than a moderately long, more continuous exposure?
That's a fantastic question, and exactly something that has been playing in the back of my mind through this research over the last decade. And that is, of course, a pile, how long does a pile take to drive in? Probably not more than half an hour, 45 minutes. And so then it takes time to then set up the next pile. But then if you have multiple pile drivers, because you've got a short window to complete everything, what does that mean? And then you need to think obviously about cumulative impacts of, 2 in 2 different positions. However, in my mind, I think and again, it's a case by case situation, depending on how the animals, whether it's dolphins or marine mammals, other marine mammals like whales or turtles or whatever it is that's using the area, is exactly how do they use the area. So if they're just transiting through it, well, it makes sense to just give them an opportunity to transit through if it's critical habitat that they need to traverse. However, if it's an area that they're occupying over a long period of time and it is critical habitat, then shifting pile driving activity to a time outside of that period, in my mind, would seem to make a lot more sense.
Okay, got another question from online. This one's from Craig in Sydney. In addition to procedural changes to piling as a form of mitigation to dolphins, do you see a role for bubble curtains or other noise dampening devices? Yeah,
okay. That's a fantastic question, Craig. And I'm sure, again, many people in the room and online virtually, I'd love to do a poll actually and see how many people have recommended or used bubble curtains. I'm going to do one in the room. How many people have? Excellent. Okay. So Adam from Fremantle Ports put his hand up, and that was the only person. So the research that is coming out, which I'm sure many of you have seen, certainly suggests that it can dampen the sound. And so it makes sense to be able to implement that where possible to be able to reduce impacts on animals around. So absolutely. But of course, it depends heavily on the design of that bubble curtain and how it's used. And so, I've heard of some instances where it wasn't very effective at all because it didn't have the right design. So something to keep in consideration. And again, I'm really happy to hear others' experiences.
I've probably got time for 1 or 2 more questions. I'm going to come back to the room.
So it's more a personal question. I love rowing upstream on the Swan River. We sometimes have the pleasure to see these dolphins. But my question is, how big is their habitat and what is the reason for the dolphins to go all the way upstream? Because you don't see them there very often, but what can you tell about that? Do they go out to the sea? Why do they go upstream? And
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. So the home range of the Swan Canning River Park community, as you have seen them, I'm sure as a rower, you've seen them quite upriver, have you? Yeah, so they got past Guildford. Yeah, so they go past Guildford, and then from that community, they'll use the entire Swan Canning River estuary, as far up the Canning as they can, up to the Weir, and then they'll use Owen Anchorage area as well. And so your question is, why would they go up that far upriver? Yeah, so it's really interesting because you know, really a home range, the research points to a home range really being driven by the resources that are available within that habitat. So if there are sufficient resources within that habitat, then that's the home range, obviously, to do all the different things that they need to do in their life processes. Which includes types of habitat, so protection for youngs as well as prey. So, and then of course the size of the community will be driven by the resources as well. So for whatever reason, this is the home range of the community within the Swan River, and there must be advantages in going upriver. We don't know exactly what those advantages are, but yeah, we'll keep you posted. Yeah, trackers. Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So trackers certainly for whales and seals and sea lions and turtles. However, with dolphins here in Australia, it's, yeah, to get a tracker, so a tag on a dolphin is quite a stressful endeavor for the dolphin. And so at the moment, there are, as far as I know, unless there's been something recent, there are no cases of putting satellite tags or other tags on dolphins because it does need to be ethical for the animals as well. So not yet. In the US, absolutely, and in other areas of the world. That sounded weird. Yeah, but again, you know, there are cases of tags, you know, in other locations on other species that have caused problems. So Australia is really quite, I think, quite responsible in that manner and trying to make sure to do it the right way.
I think there might be a couple more questions in the room, but I'm mindful of time, and the guys in the room will be heading down to Varsity Bar, and any of our online WA audience are welcome to join us down at Varsity Bar in Nedlands. I might just ask this one very brief last question before signing off from the online community. It's basically talking about, speaking of monopiles for offshore wind turbines, vibratory installation has been considered a more environmentally friendly option to conventional impact-driven technology. Simple question, do you agree?
Yeah. So obviously the signals, as you know, are so different, and certainly the rapid change in pressure of an impulsive signal is the cause for concern for injury, whereas vibratory has that continuous noise signal. So in terms of acute, you know, impacts such as injury, you know, ruptures of gas-filled cavities and hearing impairment, probably a continuous noise is a better option. Now, in terms of the offshore wind turbines, I've not actually looked at the levels, the sound pressure levels for vibratory pile driving, but certainly here in the Fremantle Inner Harbour, comparing the two different ones with the equipment that was used, absolutely it was a lower level than impact pile driving. So I hope that somewhat answers part of the question at least.
Okay. I'd say thanks, Chandra. So we're just going to sign off now. So thanks to everyone for joining us online. I hope you guys are getting together around the country in little groups. I wonder if this is going to be something we're going to see a little bit more of in future, and we'll be looking at each other this way. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again at the next event. Thank you.